Welcome to This Week from the Principal's Desk, a podcast about Lutheran schools and their leadership. This podcast is hosted by two Lutheran school leaders. My name is Rob Lunak, and I'm the superintendent of Lutheran neighborhood schools in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and my co-host is Mike Sheeman.
And my name is Mike Sheeman. I'm principal at Bethany Lutheran School in Parma, Ohio. And I'm kind of excited for this episode because we're going to expand on something that we talked about earlier. A little while ago, we talked all about budgets and numbers and things like that. And we said we need to do part two. So today we're doing part two. I think there's a couple of reasons why we're kind of hitting this as we record. It is September 7th. You probably just got your school year off the ground, probably excited. Things are going well. And yet we're talking about budgeting again for another year. Part of that is because budgeting is such an important cycle. And as you are going through every aspect of your school year, including the beginning, it's important to start thinking about budgeting. And in two ways, I would say. How did your budget from last year go when you forecasted onto this year? And now that you're running this year, it's time to already start thinking about next year as you hit those expenses or start realizing income and things like that so that you know where you're going and you have a bit of an idea. So we talked a little bit higher level, I would say, in our last budget episode. This one, I think we want to dive a little bit deeper into the mechanics of budgeting and to talk a little bit about some of the line items, some of the balance sheet stuff, just to give you a bit of an overview on how that all works.
Yeah, that first episode was a good general topic. This one, we're going to get a little more into the weeds here. And so if budgeting is not your strong suit, grab a cup of coffee. And if it is, get your keyboard fingers ready to let us know if we did anything wrong. We're always open to that. We make mistakes too. So the first part I want to talk about is actually you might be the wrong person for the budgeting job as principal. You as principal, we talk about this all the time, do not have to be the person that does everything. You have to be the person that is the principal. You don't have to be the person that mows the lawn. You don't have to be the person that does the budget. You don't have to be the person that fixes the roof, right? You have to be the principal and know where your gifts are and know where your time is being used and know where your time is used most wisely. And if you are spending a bunch of time on the budget to the detriment of other things, really consider, should you hire that out to somebody else? Maybe you're an accountant by trade and you love it and you're the best person for it. Cool, great. Maybe you're not. And numbers make your eyes hurt and you just go, can someone else do this? And then you got to figure out, should you have it in as a budgeted position for somebody to do that? If you are in any school that has, or any place that has state choice programs, there's audits that usually go along with that. So you probably already have somebody who's trained in all that, who does those numbers pretty well, and that's good. If you're in a smaller school where maybe it's been a volunteer, I would seriously consider looking at getting a paid position for this just because it's going to streamline things. And someone who knows what they're looking at is going to help you save money down the road and help you more effectively use the resources that God has given you. So that's the very first thing. You should really have somebody whose job is budgeting and numbers.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think, too, one of the things, though, you are the principal. And so these decisions, when it comes to spending money, that is part of what your call is to serve at the school where you are. So while you may have somebody else that does the background work, you really need to be the one that informs them of those things. So when I started this whole career, this whole God-given path of principal, I really didn't know a lot about the budget. I knew that we had to manage it. I had to figure it out. But how do you create the Excel sheet with the formulas and the things that make it all work? And that was not my wheelhouse. And so at the time, I was able to work with our treasurer and basically said, here's what I need, make it work. And this person did a beautiful job. Now, on my way I'm in year 16, I think, of being a principal, I learned those things. I'm going to encourage you that if you're kind of newer to the role or and numbers scare you, maybe make that a goal to learn how it all works, because you are in a better place to inform and support and even to maybe identify potential pitfalls if you do know how that back end works. But Rob said something really important, that you may not be the person for all those things. It's true. One of the things that I know a lot of principals do is they put a lot of work into things that maybe aren't their gifted area of giftedness, or um, something that might be a struggle to them, it's okay to hire things out. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the podcast with some ideas, but recognize that your time is valuable as well. And if you're beating your head against a wall, there are people out there that can help you with those things. So don't be afraid of those things, but I'll start off by scaring you. So let's just talk about one area that is going to be the bulk of your budget. Let's talk about salaries. So when you're budgeting salaries, one of the things I learned is, yeah, you can punch those numbers in, but did you factor in the FICA cost? Did you factor in the called worker offset cost if your school does that? Did you factor in retirement and disability and health benefits and workman's comp? All those residual costs that are like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that. So when you see a teacher's salary, yeah, you've got that number, but really, especially if they take health for a whole family, you're looking at doubling that number. From the salary point. So having a full comprehensive spreadsheet that links to various things like the cost of living index and other things like that is going to be really important so that your budget is real. It'll either scare you to a degree that you're going, oh my gosh, we can't afford this, and then you have to get creative. Or it might say, hey, we're in a better position than we thought, so I can go ahead and bring on that extra tutor or whatever it is. But know how that stuff works too, because if you're a Concordia Plan school, you're required to offer benefits to people if they're at 30 hours or greater in your school. So I have a whole bunch of 29 and a half hour employees, and that's intentional because I want to take care of my employees, but I know that some of them are linked to spouses that get health insurance, or they don't need it for reason X, Y, and Z. And so I also don't want to, it is okay to ask somebody, do you need this or not? You're required to ask that if they're over 30 hours, but they might say no. And so that can all play into your budget. So really know your salaries, know your salary grid, and know all of the extra benefits that work into that. So I kind of beat that horse a little bit to death, but it's an important one because salaries in general, I'm going to say, make up between 80 and 90% of a school's budget.
Yeah, that is the lion's share of your costs because you are in the people business. So you spend your money on your people. Now, something that I want to point out, just in case anybody heard what Mike said about offering insurance is trying to get really creative. If you have somebody over 30 and they decline insurance coverage and then their situation changes, they're entitled to it. You can't be like, no, you turned it down. I'm sorry, it's too late. So if you're trying to get really creative with your budget and someone is at 35 hours and they say, I don't need it, you should probably still budget for it anyway, just in case. Put that in a rainy day fund because if that person's situation changes and they say, hey, I need benefits now, you have to give them benefits now. And you can't like reduce their hours then either because there are employment laws about all that. So be careful with some of that as well. That health insurance cost, that is something that it goes up every year. Plan on increases for that every year. So as you are budgeting that number, look at what the past 3 years increases have been, take that average and assume that it's going to go up that much. That will just always, always go up. And that is something that we have teachers who have families. That's not a bad thing. And so we have family coverage. And family coverage, as Mike said, nearly doubles the salary package for some people. It gets up there. So keep that in mind. When you are working on your budget, don't be afraid to shop around for some of those things as well. You don't have to use the same thing you've always used. Just like your car insurance at home, you shop around every once in a while. That doesn't mean you always want to change just because something's a little cheaper, because there are other things that go into that. Maybe one company's easier to work with. Maybe one company's more reliable. Maybe it's a better experience for your workers with a different company, even though they're a little more money. All those things should be factored into that. You shouldn't just go, what's the bottom line? What's the dollar amount? I've heard stories of people changing from one insurance provider because someone else like, oh, we're like 15 grand cheaper. And they moved over and then it was awful.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people say, yeah, we moved to one that's actually more expensive, but it offers this, 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 and this for our families and our workers, and they really like it, and it's got all these ancillary benefits that go with it. So those are things you should definitely, you want to weigh. If you are just going for what's cheapest, it's cheapest not to have a school. That's what's cheapest. But you're not in the business of doing what's cheapest.
Yeah. And actually, I'll give you a story on that one, Rob, that at one school where I served, we had an insurance company and we were paying the premium. And of course, another one came in to try to like woo us over. We're going to be so much cheaper, and you're going to get all these extra things. And we did our homework, and sure enough, that was true. We switched over to a company, saved us a ton of money, and we got a whole bunch more on top of it. And the customer service was great. So it's something that's good to always review. Take a look at it. And now in my story, that worked in our favor. But you're right. I've heard the horror stories where it's like, well, hey, we were going to save a little bit of money and we ended up not saving money at all. But yeah, shopping around is a good call. Um, if I continue to talk a little bit more about some of your expense lines, you really should have everything clearly articulated in your budget with what your expense lines are. I hate the word miscellaneous, and so many budgets have this miscellaneous, which is a bit of a catch-all. And I get it. I get like all of a sudden you needed to have your piano in your music room tuned. Well, that didn't fall into curriculum. It didn't fall into salaries. You don't have a piano tuning category. You just randomly threw it into facilities or, hey, miscellaneous. Well, it's okay to define that because if you define piano tuning, I'm just, coming up with a dumb example, but it works. If you were just to define piano tuning, but you have to do that every year, well, throw it in your budget and then it helps you to budget forward. If you just have a miscellaneous line, you may know what's in there, but what if you leave? What if something happens and your new person doesn't know? Go check QuickBooks and figure it all out. Miscellaneous is a bit of a rabbit hole that you probably don't want to go down. Now, on my own budget, on the expense side, I have a whole bunch of expense categories. And one of them, I'm going to tell you, the category is called other expenses. But in that, I break out what those are, like spirit wear or yearbook or who knows, whatever else you want to put in there. Chapel offerings for us fall into that category. Make sure you can define what's in your budget because being able to define it allows conversation to be had about it and to say, do we need this? Or how can we use this to budget forward more effectively?
And you can also add notes into an Excel cell. If you are using Excel for the bulk of your budgeting, you can definitely add a little note. It was for this thing, and this thing. Because it's not just for you. Every time you budget, you are leaving a record of something and you're planning for the future. And realize that you're not always going to be the person going through the records and you're not always going to be there in the future. So that document should really serve everybody else. It should be readable. You shouldn't need a forensic degree to be able to figure out what went on in a budget. When we're talking about budgeting, there's two things I want to come back to that I think a lot of schools deal with, and that is raising tuition and deferred things. I think a lot of schools, we get to, we're going to be short next year. What are we going to do? And everyone, they're like, well, we could raise tuition. And so we always put in kind of the minimum modest raise increase for tuition. And I think sometimes we hurt ourselves by doing that because your costs are going to go up every year. And if you're not raising your tuition every year to offset that, you are just digging a hole. I'm sorry. And I know that, yes, the same is true for your families. Their costs go up every year, and maybe they're not getting a raise every year either, right? And that's tough. And how do you balance that? But it comes down to if you don't have enough funding to pay your bills, you're not going to be offering education to them anyway. You're just not. And that's the harsh business-sided reality to it, but you need to make sure that your school is sustainable long-term, and that means that you need to have costs be what they should be. And the second thing there, deferred maintenance. If you have something that needs to get done, like a roof, for instance, it only leaks in the third grade classroom. We put a bucket there, it's fine. Let's defer it another year. What's the worst that could happen? Well, that sends a message that you're building in the experience of your families is not important, honestly. That sends a message that, you know what? Yeah, okay, it leaks, and that's really annoying for Johnny because he sits right there, but we'll just move his desk, and it'll be a new kid next year. But we are not taking care of the gifts that we've been given and supporting the exceptional experiences that we say we're going to support. And so I know sometimes it happens, but I'm really, really going to strongly encourage anyone listening out there that if you can find a way to avoid deferring things like that, and sometimes that means that you need to make tough decisions about raising tuition, lean more towards the raises and less towards the deferment, because so many of our schools have started that path down deferment and they're not open anymore. And that's just the sad reality of it.
Yeah. And Rob, I'm going to take you back a sentence and I'm going to strike a word that you just said. You said, if you can find a way to do it. No, you can find a way to do it. I want to encourage everybody. Now, we've been talking about expenses and how do you manage all of this stuff? And, maybe you're listening to this and your roof really is leaking, or maybe there really is that significant maintenance issue. And you're going, yeah, but my enrollment is down. I can barely afford to pay my teacher. And then we just talked about benefits. Oh my goodness, there's so much to think about. Where is the money coming from? It's an honest, good question, because you might be in that school where you're like, I really have no way to fix that roof. It's $50,000 and I can't. Well, good news for you is that you can. Now, sometimes there's a difference between deferring for the sake of I can't afford it versus planning for how it's going to happen. And I think there's a bit of a mindset shift that could really help you with that. But we've talked a lot about expenses. Well, why don't we flip the conversation then and let's talk about income. Let's talk about those things, because in our last podcast, we talked a little bit about various sources of funding. Obviously, you've got your big three, which are your tuition, your donations, and your third source funding. And we talked about, grants. We gave some tips on how you could maybe get some grants in there. And as a sidebar, one of the things I did at a school was I had a few parents that got together. We were a grant writing team. I couldn't do it all, but there's tons of grant money out there. So I equipped parents to be able to write grants. And I mean, of course, it all funneled back to me, and I confirmed all of that before they got submitted, but I had help and it was awesome. And these parents, every time we got a grant, they were like, oh, I wrote that one. They were so excited. But there's other sources of funding that I think we can talk about. So with tuition, I agree. It does need to go up every single year. Now, contextually, you'll figure out what's that percentage, what do you need? But I would encourage you to link tuition to the actual cost of educating your kid. I can't stress that enough, is know the actual cost of education. There's some very easy ways to figure that out. But then on top of tuition, there's a lot of other sources of funding out there, and I want to highlight a few of them. One of them, outside of grants, talk to your local district, because various districts throughout the LCMS have certain grants. One district where I serve, they had a fund that when a church or school in that district closed and they sold the property, the district was given that money, and then they used that money as seed grants for schools. And so we were able to do some big stuff with that money. That's one particular district. There are other grants in other districts. And then also, I can't say enough great things about Lutheran Church Extension Fund. They have so many grant programs. Their Kaleidoscope grant program is an option, but there are programs there that you can work with your local LCEF district vice president. They call themselves the DVPs. So there's your acronym, but get to know what LCEF offers. One more kind of practical one is there's a government program called E-Rate, and E-Rate helps with all of your connectivity grants. So if you're going to be doing things like they offset internet costs for us here where I am. And recently I just actually got connected with a company, because the E-Rate funding, it is like Greek. It's unbelievable how difficult this can be. And I'm like, I'm not even going to do it. But then, an ambulance chaser caught me and said, I do this, and for a small fee. I paid her the fee. Not only did she cover my connectivity grants, but she found me an extra $20,000 for things like Chromebooks. And I'm replacing the firewall at my school. I didn't even know it was out there. But when I engaged the services of a professional, she led me down that path and said, no, I can help you with this. And she was great. So that company, their name is Nexus E-Rate Services, if you're looking for somebody there, and super inexpensive and really, really helpful. So those are just a few kind of practical things that maybe you want to take and try to run with. Rob, do you have any other things to add to that list, or other income sources you've experienced?
So the majority of our schools are tuition and giving driven for income, right? It's whatever the tuition amount is that comes in, and then whatever the set aside comes in the plate, and that gets divided up between church and school a lot of the time. And I would encourage everyone that as we get further and further away from the time when everyone went to church and everyone was a giver in church, that tuition carries more and more of that load. And so I would strongly encourage everyone to start having the conversation now, if you haven't already. What would it look like if you charged full tuition? And I don't mean we charge $2,400 and that's the our member rate, and then we charge everyone $4,800 for our community member rate, and that's full tuition. Well, that's not. No one around here has $4,800 as their full tuition cost when you factor in all expenses. So I would encourage everyone to start having that conversation right now. You don't have to go out and say, "Hey, we're raising tuition by 5,000%." That's not what I'm saying. But you need to start having that conversation so you know what that number is. So you can go out to all those other organizations and be like, look at all the great work we're doing offsetting this cost. And we'd like to be able to continue to offset that cost through grants, through fundraising, through whatever it might be. The one other thing, just really practically, is connect with the people in the city you're in or the town you're in who own businesses and show them what you're doing. And I'm not saying go and ask them for money the first time. I'm saying just go bring them some cards from your kids. Like, hey, we're down the street. Our kids made you these cards. They just want to share these with you. Love to talk about your business once in a while. Maybe we'll have coffee. And through those connections, you want people, as they give charitably, to think about you. That's what it is. And maybe you have an advancement person who does that. Maybe you have a marketing person that does that. If you don't, find somebody who you would love to form a relationship with, and maybe they give nothing, but then you have another supporter in your community, and that's great anyway. Maybe they decide that, I really love the work they're doing. Oh, you guys are struggling with this? I'll just take care of it, right? So that's always an option, and that is something you need to continually work at. And I know as principal, none of us got in this to be fundraisers. None of us did, but it's one of the hats you need to wear now.
Yeah. Yeah, and exactly. If you express that need, people with a heart for your community, heart for your school, ultimately a heart for your kids are going to fill that need. I've heard of schools that, we have an office budget line, and so we know we need staplers and paper and whatever, but they put together a Amazon wish list and put some of that stuff on the wish list, and then people could just go and directly support your school by providing for this. I always find too that giving, it needs to be attached to something that people can really get behind. So if you just say, yeah, we've got debt, would you give to pay down our debt?
Nope.
No. But if you do the Amazon wish list, and this is how you can shift things in your budget. Let's say you have an office line, and I'm just picking this as an example, and people then fund the items that are in that line. Well, then you can use that money that was in that line to pay your gas bill. It just works out how these things can all shift together. I heard recently of one school that they had a desire to grow, and there was out of the blue, a school building came up for sale really close to them. And they didn't know how it was going to all work out, but they decided to put in an offer on that building. And after a church member heard about this, the church member came and said, I'm going to buy that building for you. And they ended up getting the building debt free. Now, that's a huge story, which doesn't happen all the time. But again, they put it out there that, hey, this is what we're doing. And just by communicating their story, the gift came in. And I don't know that this principal would have known to go and ask that person for a gift, but there was a heart for the school. So Rob's right. Tell your story as much as you can. And you know what? The other thing, we're not fundraisers. Rob already said that, but sometimes it doesn't hurt to ask. I mean, isn't that Matthew 7? Ask and you shall receive. We ask not because we're trying to personally benefit ourselves. For the sake of the students in my school, I'll ask anybody any question. What's the worst they're going to say? Nope. What's the best they're going to say is yes. And I've got more yeses by asking than by just implying or insinuating or typing a, hey, this is cool kind of email. Just directly ask, this is a need. Would you be willing to fund it? See what they say.
Yeah, and that's great advice. And if they say no, send them a boatload of thank you cards anyway. Just because they're still going to think of you later on down the road, right? Very rarely is no a no never. A lot of the time, no is a no, not right now, or no, not this thing, or I'm not really excited about that thing today, so no. So definitely still keep that relationship because, as I said earlier, even if they don't give you any resources or any funding, they're another supporter you've connected with in your community, right? They're another person who's going to tell people about your school when you come up. Now, when we get to expense categories, this is something we've kind of touched on. This is the last little nuts and bolts issue here. When you break down your budget and your numbers, as Mike said, stay away from miscellaneous. Everything should have a name. Every dollar should have a name to it. Think about it this way. If you have kids and your kid said, Dad, I need $50. And you said, what for? And your kid said, fun.
Miscellaneous.
You would have lots of questions, wouldn't you? Be like, no, what exactly do you need $50 for? Your school budget is the exact same way. What exactly are you spending your money on? And even look into those little things. I had somebody say once, well, I don't want to know how much you're spending on chewing gum. And I'm like, well, I'd want to know if we had a budget line for chewing gum. I definitely want to know if that was in there, right? Their point was we don't want to be ticky-tacky with all of this, but you should know where all of your money is going. The one thing I'll say as a caveat to that, not all of that needs to be publicly shared with everybody, right? So when we would share budgets, we had one line for salaries. We didn't break out Mrs. Smith makes this, Mrs. Jones makes this, Travis, the custodian, makes this. We didn't break it out that way because that is private information in a sense, right? Like, yes, those employees work for the church and people have a right to know where their money is going, but we never wanted to break it out there publicly. Every once in a while the board would see it depending on your policies and whatnot. But I wouldn't like call out one person and be like, well, the third grade teacher we think makes too much. Look, it says right here. I'd stay away from that when you're budgeting. The categories are good. The detail I would just be careful with.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I love how you just said about you related it to your own kid because you can look at it that way. Look at how you handle your own personal finances. And really just to say, as the principal of a school, you're just like, if your school budget is your home budget on steroids. I mean, you're dealing with a lot more income, you're dealing with a lot more expenses, but it's a good way to link that together to say, know what you're spending your money on. Because in some ways too, in a lot of ways, if you want me to know what your school prioritizes and what your school really believes, show me your budget and I'll be able to tell you. Budget also tells a story. So make sure the budget is telling the story that you as a school want to be told as it relates to your mission. So I think I encourage everybody to have a look at that and look at it with those eyes. But I think there's still, even after this, there's lots more we can talk about with budget. But a lot of the things that I'm saying are just from things that I've learned, just really practical stuff. There's no real good textbook out there that I've come across that says, here's how you budget for Lutheran schools. It does require just a little bit of common sense. And you've got that in you, and you've got people around you that want you to succeed. So rely on the people that God has given. And I keep going back. I think it's Philippians 4. God will supply all your needs through his riches in Christ. So with that, know that you're going to be good. It's going to be okay. Take steps in faith. God's got your back.
I'm hearing maybe we should write a book. What I'm hearing. We should write a book on all of this stuff. One last thing before we close here. I know in a lot of Lutheran schools, budgeting is a touchy subject because it always seems like there's never enough money to do the things you want to do. And if you have other schools around you, I would just encourage you to ask them, hey, what are you guys charging for tuition? What is that amount? I don't know if we talked about it on this podcast or if I was talking about it with somebody else, but there was a Lutheran school. They added Academy to their name, changed their logo, and charged double, and they got 40 more kids than they had the year before. That's kind of all they did, right? Because they were the lowest cost one in town by a large margin. And people looked at that, especially people who weren't connected to their church, people school shopping, and they went, well, I'm not going to pay for that, right? They clearly can't be good. Look how cheap it is. There was this distrust around it. And we know we have great Lutheran schools that are very affordable, right? So as you get into this, if you're thinking that there's no way we could raise more money, there's no way we could do these things, don't say never. And I would just look at comparable Christian schools around you and see what they're charging because people are paying to go to those too. Mike and I just finished Van Lunen this past July, and talking to some of those people, they're like, what's your tuition? Oh, 26 grand. I'm like, what? You're like 15 minutes from a Lutheran school that has trouble charging 2. How are you charging 26? But people are paying it, and that extra funding, I mean, think about what you could do if your tuition revenue doubled, right? Think about all the kids you could impact and all the great mission work you could do. So don't always just say, well, it is what it is, because it's not. Because at the end of the day, you are the one kind of driving that bus and taking charge of those conversations. With that, there's a ton here. We could do like 15 more episodes on budget, but I think we might have lost some people in the weeds there. You want to close us in prayer, Mike?
Yeah, let's get out of the weeds and get up to heaven. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, thank you so much for all of the resources that you give us to be able to fulfill our callings and ultimately to fulfill your mission of sharing the gospel with kids and with their families and being lights in our community. God, budgeting is such a difficult thing from time to time. We sometimes don't know where it's coming from. Sometimes we struggle to know where it's all going, but at the end of the day, Lord, it's all yours. And so please help us to remember that you are in control, that you want your schools to succeed. And so you are going to provide for our needs. Help us to have eyes and ears that are open to ways that you're providing in ways that we might not expect or might not even see or might not think about. Give us your creative wisdom to move forward so that we can continue to be not just sustainable, God, but that we can thrive, that we can do education and ministry to a degree that is excellent. Bless all those who are listening. Bless all of our Lutheran schools and all of the students that are in them as they are blessings from you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.